Hey guys, Brian from Boas here. Today I want to cover one of the more negative aspects of breeding boas. As boa breeders, we all aim for beautiful litters of perfect healthy babies, but sometimes that doesn't happen and we end up with a few babies with malformations or birth defects. I want to go over the different types of malformations that are commonly seen in boas bred in captivity. I want to discuss some of the possible causes for these birth defects, and I'm also going to touch on how you can deal with boas that have birth defects if you find yourself in this situation. If you find this video helpful and you want to learn all about keeping and breeding boas in captivity, be sure to subscribe to the Brian Boas YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any of my future boa videos. The reason I decided to do this video is I was sexing my baby Qualky boas, which were born recently, and as you may know, I use that palpation method to sex them by feeling underneath the tail for the presence or absence of the hemipenes. And with this particular animal, when I went to feel the tail, I felt this kink. And I examined the animal a little closer, and I also saw that there was a kink in the back of the spine of the towards the tail. I don't know if you can see on camera, but there's this little bump right here. And I didn't even notice this when the boa was first born. It's, relatively minor, something that I had to feel the boa. But there's definitely several kinks in the tail and towards the tail. Kinking of the spine is a pretty common birth defect in boas and other snakes. And it can be different levels of severity. In some cases, there's this pretty massive kink in the animal, and the neck is actually bent at like a 30, 60, or even 90-degree angle. It's just, very visible. The kinks are solid. They can't bend that. Basically, the bone is kind of fused in this awkward position. But in many cases, it's relatively minor, such as with this animal, it appears to be relatively minor. And as I mentioned, I could only tell by feeling the animal, not by looking at it, although you might be able to see this little bump there. And in some cases, the kinking, it's not really a bend. The spine isn't really bent. It's just kind of a bump and a deformation, like in this particular animal. So with animals with a minor amount of kinking, they may be able to lead healthy lives, as long as they can move around and digest food normally. So with this particular animal, I just have to see how he does. And if he or she is able to eat normally and digest food okay, I may end up selling him or her at a greatly reduced price in the future as a pet, in case you're looking for that perfect special kinky Qualky boa. I thought I'd get this female Hog Island boa, not because this animal has any malformations, but it's something nice to look at while I'm talking. So in addition to kinking of the spine, birth defects that affect the head or the face of the animal are not that uncommon. And some of these include cleft lip and palate, where basically the front of the snout didn't form properly and there's kind of a cleft or separation. Sometimes you'll see animals where the top of the head isn't properly formed and there's kind of like missing parts of it. Another type of malformation of the head that's sometimes seen in boas is called prognathism. And prognathism, which is your vocabulary word for the day, refers to a protruding upper or lower jaw. So basically a massive overbite or underbite. And in the case of a massive overbite, this is called maxillary prognathism. In the case of an underbite, this is called mandibular prognathism. In many cases, prognathism can be somewhat subtle, but there's also cases where it's more pronounced. And this condition an animal can live with, provided that there's no interference with the animal's normal eating of food. Another common malformation is called anophthalmia, another vocab word. But anophthalmia is the lack of one or both eyes. And this was seen relatively frequently in the cow albinos when the cow albinos first became available. And it was thought that this was occurring because there was a large amount of inbreeding that people did to propagate this morph. But fortunately, the cow albinos have now been outcrossed with unrelated genetic stock, so the anophthalmia or lack of eyes isn't nearly the problem that it once was in the cow albinos. The last type of malformation I want to bring up is called bicephaly, which is a two-headed snake. And bicephaly is a type of a conjoined twin. So when an animal is a twin, normally the embryo splits into two, and you have two separate animals that develop. But in some cases, the embryo only splits partially, which leads to a conjoined twin. So if the embryo of a boa or another snake splits just the right amount, basically what can happen is that you have two heads that form, and they're on just a single body, which is your two-headed or bicephalic snake. And bicephaly is relatively rare in snakes. It occurs somewhere on the order of about once in every 100,000 births. But with all of the breeding that's been going on in captivity, it happens on a fairly regular basis. There's a case of a two-headed snake. A lot of people think it would be really cool to have a pet two-headed snake, and many people have paid huge amounts of money for these types of animals. But it could be a challenge because the two-headed snake has two separate brains that work independently that control the same body. So the wishes of one brain are often at odds with the desires of the other brain. One of the challenges is that when you're feeding these animals, you have to feed both heads at the same time, or they're going to fight over the food. And in some cases, one head will eat the food quicker, and then it tries to attack the other head, and it can lead to all kinds of problems. So, feeding them is a major challenge. The animals with the two heads, they don't know that they have the same body and that the food is going to go to the same stomach, so they end up fighting over it. And then another challenge is that these animals can't really move around in a coordinated fashion because you have two brains telling the one body how to move, and it usually is not coordinated. However, many of these two-headed snakes have been able to live healthy lives, and they lived up into their 20s. And there's even at least one case of a two-headed snake that reproduced successfully. Incidentally, all the babies were normal one-headed snakes. The two-headed snake is basically a congenital malformation. It's not caused by a gene like an albino, so you can't really breed for two-headed snakes. It's never going to be a morph that people breed for. This is my male Coups Pastel Colombian boa. Just thought I'd get him out. I always enjoy handling this guy. But now I wanted to go over some of the different causes that can lead to these malformations. And first I want to point out that in many cases it's not really clear what's causing these malformations. When we think about embryonic development, it's an extremely complicated process, and there's a lot that can go wrong. So it's not surprising that we do occasionally see these malformations that occur. The other thing is that in many cases there might be multiple causes, so you can't just simply point to one cause as the cause for the malformations. The first cause of malformations is inbreeding. And inbreeding is a complicated and somewhat controversial topic. I actually did a video previously on inbreeding entitled Inbreeding in Boas, Is It a Problem? So I urge you to check that one out if you're interested in learning more about inbreeding. But inbreeding is definitely associated with malformations. And there are a number of different morphs of different types of snakes that are inbred, and they're known to have a higher prevalence of different malformations. There's a number of different corn snake and ball python morphs that have a high rate of kinking, much more than you would see in the general population of these snakes. And I already mentioned the cow albinos, that when the cow albino first came out, there was a high prevalence of animals missing one or both eyes, which was due to the inbreeding. So you want to avoid inbreeding to avoid these types of malformations. The second has to do with inappropriate incubation conditions, either incubation of the eggs or incubation of the gravid females in the live-bearing snakes like boas. So there are certain parts of the gestation period of these snakes that are very critical, and early on in the gestation all of the organs are forming, and this is really the critical period. So if there's some kind of a physical or chemical disturbance of the developing embryos at this point, it's likely to lead to these malformations. One inappropriate incubation condition during gestation that can lead to malformations is when you incubate animals or eggs at too high of an incubation temperature. and this is associated with an increase in the number of these deformities. In addition, exposure to certain types of chemicals or even certain types of radiation can lead to an increase in the prevalence of these different types of deformities. Another potential cause of kink spines might be slugs. And as you may know, slugs are unfertilized embryos. They're these oval, rubbery, kind of rigid masses that take up space in the uterus of the mother. So a mother boa might have a number of these slugs, as well as a number of healthy, fertilized embryos. So the healthy embryos might be kind of pushed up against the slugs, and because the slugs have this kind of rigid shape that might deform the spine of the developing embryos, and they might take on that shape. And so you'll see these, as a result, the spine has this very abrupt kink to it. And I actually did have one litter of boas a few years ago that had a number of slugs, something like 5 or 6. And there were 2 animals which unfortunately had these pretty massive kinks to the spine. They looked like they were at like 60-degree angles, just this, very rigid, very abrupt bend in the neck of these animals. So the last thing that can lead to these malformations is just random chance. There's not really any specific cause. So as I mentioned, development of a boa during embryogenesis is very complicated, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong. In fact, it's almost amazing we don't see more malformations in boas and other animals. So if you do happen to have a litter with 1 or more malformed babies, many times there's really nothing you could have done to prevent it. This is just something that's bound to happen. And if you have enough litters of boas or any other snakes, you're bound to eventually see some animals that have these deformities. So the last thing I want to cover is if you do have an animal that has a birth defect, how should you handle this? And so this is, of course, a very controversial topic because we get into the subject of culling or euthanasia, which is deliberately putting down animals with unwanted characteristics. And the controversy is that some breeders will claim that any animal with any kind of unwanted characteristic like this should be euthanized, with the rationale being that they could potentially pass on the genes which might lead to an increased prevalence of these deformities. And as I mentioned, these deformities aren't usually simply genetic, like albinism or any kind of morph like the jungle morph or the anerythristic morph, which is just one gene. It's really mostly a congenital problem. Something goes wrong during development, which may have a genetic predisposition. But some breeders claim that any animal with these deformations should be put down. However, many animals can live normal, healthy lives with the presence of these deformities. And what it comes down to is, will the animal be able to eat and digest food and move around normally? And if the answer to the question is yes, then the animal can be kept alive as a pet. It's certainly not advisable that these animals be bred for the reasons I just pointed out. But in many cases, they can make completely fine pets. For example, animals that have a kink in the tail that doesn't affect their digestion, or even animals with just one eye. They can lead a normal, healthy life with only the one eye. So this is somewhat of a judgment call. You have to decide, is the animal going to be able to have a sufficient quality of life that it should be allowed to live and to be used as a pet? And then you need to sell the animal or give away the animal specifically as a pet to someone that's not going to breed it. And that's where it gets a little controversial, because in some cases the person might go on and try to breed the animal anyway, which gets back to the original argument that some breeders think that any animal that has these issues should be put down. If you have an animal with like a major kink and the animal is not even able to eat because the food can't get past the kink, unfortunately you're going to have to euthanize the animal. And this, of course, is a very touchy subject, and people don't like to talk about this. But if an animal has this malformation that prevents it from eating, it's just going to end up starving to death, which that's no way for an animal to go. So there are a number of ways that animals can be euthanized, and this, of course, is another very controversial topic that no one really likes to talk about. But traditionally, people would use CO2, carbon dioxide, or a freezer to euthanize animals like this. Both of these methods are probably not humane. With CO2, because reptiles have a much slower metabolism than mammals, it takes them a lot longer to suffocate and die. So CO2 is not really recommended. Putting an animal in the freezer is also not really recommended because the animal will take quite a long time to freeze to death, and there will be formation of ice crystals inside of the tissues, which could be very painful. So another method is decapitation, and unfortunately when you decapitate a snake, the brain can go on living for some time after that, and the animal can sense pain and things like that. One suggestion is pithing, or basically physical destruction of the brain, either by crushing the head or by using some kind of a blunt object to basically destroy the brain immediately. And this is probably a more humane way for the snake. Most people would probably not be able to do this. It's just psychologically so hard to do this to an animal, that there's probably something wrong with you if you want to do these kinds of things. A couple other ways: you can take your snake to the vet for a lethal injection, which might be the most humane way to go. Or some boa breeders will actually get a king snake or another type of snake-eating snake, and they just feed the imperfect offspring to the king snake. And this kind of recycles them, and it gives you an excuse to go out and buy another cool pet, a king snake. So I don't have a king snake. I thought about picking one up just for this specific purpose, which I might do at some point in the future. So again, all of these different methods are somewhat controversial, and there's not really a clear-cut way of what the best way to euthanize a malformed boa is. So do your reading and get input from other sources and make up your mind if you're ever in this kind of situation. So I hope all of your boa litters have perfect babies and you don't need to be in this kind of situation. But if you are, I hope this video was somewhat helpful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot me a line. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.